welcome everyone to the Data Science Hangout. And I know most people who are on today, you've been here before, so you kind of know the drill. But for anyone who's new today, this is an open space for current and aspiring data science leaders to connect and just chat about some of the more human-centric questions around data science leadership, but also to focus on questions that are most important to you all. So there's 3 ways that you can ask questions. You could just jump in live, put questions in the chat, or we also do have a Slido link where you can ask anonymous questions too. And Rob will share that link in the chat in just a moment here. But just a quick note that the session will be recorded and shared up to YouTube. So just want to make you aware of that if you're jumping in live. But again, feel free to ask questions anonymously too. I'm so happy to be joined by my co-host for today, Zac Garland, manager of Econometrics and Data Science at Mastercard. And Zac, I'd love to just have you introduce yourself and maybe share a bit about the work that you're doing on your team today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Zac Garland. I'm part of the Economics Institute at Mastercard. And I think the easiest way to kind of summarize what we do, we like building cool shit. And I'll try to not cuss, but I wanted to make this feel very open. I'm obviously not in a suit or, anything special. I'm kind of in, what I'm in every day. And so, yeah, open questions, feel free to ask anything. Yeah, excited to be here.
Awesome. So while we're waiting for a few questions to come in as well, Zac, I think one of the things that was really interesting to me chatting with you this week is really about the ways that you make people interested in data and then the work that you're doing on your team. And I think it'd be cool to just maybe share a few examples of some of the stuff that you're working on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess there's a lot of broad things that data science covers. I think that we try to figure out how to approach it really holistically. From the point that you pull the data to transforming the data or visualizing it and, I guess some simple plots. And then how does that eventually make its way to either a product or an output like a report? So, one of the ways that we're constantly communicating is really a public report. And then we have kind of our client presentations or I guess you could say stakeholder presentations where that's really the summarized view. And in general, I think that we always try to summarize, big topics in a way that everyone can consume. And that's my dog, Winston, by the way, for anyone that was curious.
I was gonna say, I love the dog running up in the background.
Yeah, no, he's the day one homie, but yeah, and I think that we try to find ways to explain it to a 6th grader, right? Like I think within data science, you can get very, very in the weeds and it's all super exciting for people that understand it. But for someone that's not familiar with data science or how to interpret data, you almost have to find a way to really explain it or find a way to summarize your ideas. And so I think that that's always been kind of a driving factor for us. And even, we have this framework where it's, what am I looking at and why does it matter? And it's a very, 2 very simple questions, but I think it gets to the heart of what you're trying to do, which is, show something and then why does that matter? And so, yeah, that's kind of a side comment, but.
Awesome. And kind of going on that path as well, I see Kevin, you just asked a question around what's your latest fun project that you've worked on?
Yeah, so I would say that it was a very fun project, but it was very, very work intensive. So we're coming out with a small business report, and the fun thing, at least from my perspective, I like developing. I like code. And I've been learning JavaScript, trying to find more ways to use it. And so from my perspective, the most exciting or fun thing was I finally found a way to have um, basically a static rendered R Markdown map show all of these individual city level leaflet maps. And so I'm talking in R, but I think that's probably acceptable here. But it was super fun for me to figure that out and find a way to make it work. And yeah, I think it's a very visually appealing report. And so I think we're releasing it next Tuesday, and I can send out a link to that. But there is just a general, Mastercard services.com/economics institute where you can find like most of our public reports. And so that's a really good place to at least kind of see what's accessible or out in the public, view. And then outside of that, I would say that we're constantly trying to focus on the business or trying to understand where does this fit in the big picture? How do we provide value to our clients? How do we provide value to our stakeholders? And so those are always, really exciting. Those are more thought processes, or how do we, think about this? How do we think about it differently? What's bad? What's good? So on and so forth. So, yeah.
One question that I had for you, and if anybody else has other questions you want to ask live, feel free to jump in. Um, but I know Mastercard being such a huge company, I was curious how you go about like showing the value of open source and explaining to maybe other stakeholders the importance of open source.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, so I think when I think about open source, I mean, I'm in love with open source. I think there's a lot of value in sharing code and using code, debugging code, and having that all available. And so, I mean, one of the reasons why I'm such a RStudio supporter or advocate is all of the packages were built for some reason, and they all more or less speak together. They talk to each other. They have the ability to integrate functions with one another. And I think when you start to build from scratch, which is really what I joined shortly after the group was started, and there wasn't any paved pathway or any determined this is what we have to do. And so when you start from scratch like that, it offers the ability to really design a full framework or a entire system or an entire portal, however you want to kind of describe it. But it makes it interesting when you start doing that to see how much you're leveraging open source, because it's probably a lot. And that's always been kind of my view, that many companies are seeing the end result of open source, but I think the conversation really has started to turn more towards, how do we start to be an active member? How do we start to think about what we need to keep very secure and I guess behind some form of authentication? And then how do we also start to generate new ideas with open source? Or how do we start to partner with them to take on a big project? Or if we have an idea, how do we start to think about what can be open source versus what couldn't be? And I think the easiest like intro to that is talking through inner source. So how do we share within the company first? How do we start to approach, broad frameworks, or building out all of these different components? And so I think the inner source conversation is an easier one to approach or get into, but I think eventually that really transitions into how do we talk about open source, how do we view open source, and how do we really collaborate and contribute.
That's one of the first times I myself have heard the like inner source and open source conversation, and was just curious if others from the group as well have talked about it that way or thought about it that way with leadership?
We've talked about it and implemented certain things, but I like having the term that specifically identifies what you're saying. I'm going to totally take your term. Inner source. That's awesome.
Sure, for what it's worth, it's not my term. I don't remember where I read it, but I was like, yes, that's exactly it. Like, yeah, I'm trying
Well, thank you for sharing it.
Of course, yeah.
I like that. Daniel, I see that you asked a question in the chat and wanted to pass the mic over to you to have you ask that live.
Sure. So basically my question was just if you could talk a little bit about kind of like the idea generation and idea refinement process to kind of get to things that you actually want your team to work on, in the sense that, like, I think a common dilemma is that, like, I just use business as kind of like the non-tech folks, but like the business folks kind of know a lot about their individual problem areas, but don't know about the tech side, and the tech side obviously knows the tech side, but not the business side. And so you can get ideas from either or, but like how you go about kind of getting this from the larger number of like potential projects to the ones that like you actually have your team working on.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a great question. I would say that our team is constantly generating ideas. And so I would say that we have a very almost open board when it comes to new ideas or doing new things. And I think we're very quick to drop something that, you know, we thought was interesting, but then turns out it would take too much, or the data would be too hard to pull, or there's some, you know, something that causes us to kind of change paths. And then when we find something that's really good, I would say that we invest in it and we double down on it. And I like that approach because it's almost an open, you know, collaboration between teams. Like, how do we come up with the best ideas? How do we move on from bad ideas quickly? And then how do we really hone in on what's good? And so I think it works well. You know, the hard part about it is sometimes managing a lot of things going on at once. I think for anyone that codes or is in data science, they know how intense some of the projects can get. And so I think managing expectations and trying to communicate, you know, requirements or needs is super important. But generally, you know, if you have good ideas, or you can constantly come up with new ones and find a way to really communicate them, it makes for a fun environment.
Can I just ask one quick follow-up to that, based on part of what you were saying? Like, I like the idea of kind of being able to pivot quickly, and doubling down on kind of like the things that are worth doubling down on. Do you ever get pushback when you're dropping some of the stuff that is no longer seen as important, and kind of like how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be pushback from some area, right? Where there's so many people to please, and there's so much that you know is in the realm of possibilities or opportunities. And you know, I think managing expectations and really just trying to communicate is super important. And you know, I think that that's where sometimes you get into trouble, is not communicating needs, or not, you know, finding a way to really communicate so that someone else has understanding. And yeah, so I mean, the short answer is there's no perfect solution, and there's always going to be someone that wants to go one way and you want the other. But the more that you can kind of be confident in what you're planning to do or want to do, and then really just doing it, it makes it a lot easier to kind of come back with, well, we didn't get this done, but here's what we got done. And you know, things like that are helpful in that.
Do you have any tips on communicating those expectations?
I almost want to say I'll let you know when I find them, but I would say, really just going back to kind of how do we explain this to someone that doesn't understand it? And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is kind of treat it like you're explaining it to a 6-year-old. How do you explain the big picture? What's the goal? Why does it matter? What does it require? And not getting too in the weeds of the details, I guess. I think anytime that you approach data science, you're always going to find people that really don't understand it, or don't understand what's involved with the code or how it needs to scale. And so the more that you can kind of bring it to a mutual understanding or common ground, that makes it easier. But it's certainly a topic that I think over time will get better. I think data fluency is something that will improve in the future. I think more and more people will code. I would love to see it. I guess from my perspective, I'm a self-taught coder, and so I think there's so much great material out in open source, whether that's books or videos, webinars, packages. All of it really comes together to create a more open environment where that understanding starts to bridge. But I think we're kind of early in the game. Like, I think that data science is relatively new, even though it's super, super old. But the concept of, how much data is becoming available and how much data is being generated really opens up that door for people to start having that conversation.
Thank you. Tatiana, I see you asked a question in the chat around a framework. Would you want to introduce yourself and jump in and ask that question?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for organizing. This is great. Thanks, Zachary, for sharing your knowledge so generously. This is appreciated. I got some online certifications in data science. Obviously, I'm not a super big expert in the subject, and I'm willing to learn. I'm currently working as a business intelligence analyst. And I have a question about frameworks that you use when approaching a new topic, from how you manage expectations to how you decide which project, in your words, is good or bad. Do you have specific KPIs that you go to measure your new project against? Do you have specific steps that you go from, deciding on whether or not to take it on to measuring which model it's best to use, to maybe setting adoption targets and making sure that the data is validated and the users are using it? So any tips that you can give regarding that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And so I guess the way that I've approached projects has always been, and not always. I wish that I had approached projects, always this way, but I always start with a package. And the first package that I started at the Economics Institute was this package called EI Tools. And it's a conglomerate of many things in the tidyverse or in Use This, for anyone that's familiar with that. But I always start with a package. So anytime I have a new idea, I build out, a simple package and then store it, everything that's related to that inside of that package. And I think what that offers the opportunity to do is to really have organization around all of the things going on. So if an idea gets dropped, it's not a big deal. It's still there, but at least it's getting to the right framework or starting to be in the right form before you really pursue something. And so I guess by way of example, when I was getting started, I built out this big application, and it had a ton of functionality, and it was more or less just me learning. But I didn't build it in a package. Files were hard referenced, and there was just a million things that could have been improved if I had come up with kind of that initial package structure. And so I think the more that you kind of dive into projects, you start to kind of find a flow. And I think the package structure really works well for me. And I would say it's not an easy thing to get through. None of it's easy, and it all takes a lot of time. And and learning, trying, failing, all things that I've done. And so, yeah, I would say as long as you have kind of a positive mindset about it and try to get things organized, the better off you'll be. And then in terms of, model performance and how to think about all of that, I think it's such a big topic that there's no perfect answer. I think the more that you can focus on kind of the end output or what the value is of what you're trying to do, the better. And then the rest of it is kind of just details.
Thank you, Zac. I see there's a lot of conversation going on in the chat around a specific question too. So Hugh, I'd love to have you ask your question live.
Sure. And thank you, Septori and Bruno. Those are really good thoughts, things I hadn't considered before. I'm also mostly self-taught. It's nice to hear that I'm not alone. But one of the things that I know I personally struggle with is every time I pick up a new resource or any kind of training, I'm finding things that I feel like I should have known early on, or blind spots in my knowledge. Do you have any strategies for kind of proactively seeking those out?
Yeah, so I think it's a very individual question where I think there's plenty of ways that people can learn. For me, I love books, and I have too many that I haven't read, too many that I buy and I'm like, I'm gonna read it, and then I just don't. But what I like about books is if you start from the very top and you finish it, you have so much knowledge that author had. And so a great example is just the data science for our book. It took me a long time to really get through the entire book, go through all the exercises, and to really understand the concepts. But once I felt like I had really mastered all the concepts or really read through all the chapters, I felt like I had almost a framework. And same thing with the R packages book, or the Mastering Shiny book. And there's actually this book that's called the Big Book of R. And it's basically just links to books on different topics or different ideas, different approaches, or things that you could learn. And so I always think that that's a really great reference. Videos are super helpful, at least for me. But I mean, anything, training courses, or, in-person meetups, and I know we're kind of still in COVID, so maybe not in-person meetups, but things like this, how do you think about new ideas or get someone else to share ideas on code or data science, modeling, all of these different things that are available. So yeah, I would say that the fear of not knowing what you should have known, that's always present. Like, I know that there's a million things I don't know, but I do know that there's ways to find it, or to learn it. And so as long as you kind of have a learning mindset, then that's always the best place to start.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So your stack of unread books sounds like you're describing my nightstand.
I have a coffee table, and I think sometimes when people come over and they'll see it, like right now, the book that I haven't gotten all the way through, would love to, is this book called Full Stack D3. And it's this gorgeous book, gorgeous cover. And it's just this massive textbook. And I think people always come in and they're like, you're not reading this. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not. Like, but I'm trying to, I'm trying to, so.
The question is, is your nightstand and coffee table made of these books, or the book is sitting on top?
I do like woodworking, so I actually built like my record stand, but haven't made anything out of books. That's a new idea, so maybe I'll have to think about that.
I see there's a few helpful books that people are sharing in the chat window as well, so feel free to share any others there for anyone listening in too. There's a few anonymous questions coming in too, so I want to make sure I ask a few of those. And the first one was, how do you communicate your results? Do you use the open source solution, enterprise cloud, or something else?
Yeah, so I think that that's a great question. So I think when you're developing on your own, you have open source to leverage and really constantly evolving technology. And I think when you're in a company, the thing that I didn't understand before was really, you know, there are predetermined systems or predetermined technology solutions that you kind of have to start with, where, you know, even if there's a better solution out there, what's available is kind of what you get. And so I think there's almost this balance between what do we have access to today and what do we really want to have access to tomorrow. You know, and how do we start to communicate where these different technologies come into place or what that would enable you to do. And I think, you know, developing on your own, I would always urge people to constantly push new technologies and to find ways to really utilize them. And I saw this PDF where it went over the data landscape or all of the different technologies that are going on in the world. And there's so much. And so I think opportunity is there. And you just have to find out how do we kind of hand pick what's really going to work for our group or for the company. And then how do we start to kind of pursue it? Yeah, hopefully that helps.
Following up on that question, I guess, if you like find a technology that you want to pursue, what does that process look like for you, or what tips do you have for someone who's trying to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that really gets to communicating with stakeholders, right? So finding some way to use what you have access to today to provide value, and then coming back and saying, I know that you love this, but here's what we could do with this. And I think it's really, you know, finding ways to produce something that people really understand and view as valuable, and then showing them how that new technologies or additional systems could really enhance that or improve it, scale it, and just showing them kind of what that next step might look like. But really just opening up the conversation, you know, finding ways to ask questions or to say, here's something that I think would be super valuable. How should we approach that? Because I think that that's also something that people should be comfortable with, is you're not always going to know how to do something like that or how to really start asking those questions. And so I think, you know, just starting with, hey, here's something I'm thinking through. Here's why I think that might be valuable. You know, how should we think about that? Or how could we approach that? Is always super, super helpful.
Cool, thank you. Bruno, I see you had asked a question earlier around the data that Zac works with. Would you want to ask that question live?
Yeah, sure. Hi, thanks for meeting.
Oh, I think you just muted yourself on accident.
Sorry.
There you go.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for doing this. I was just wondering, at the Mastercard scale, like with many data scientists, how do you process everything you can use? Like you have access to so much data. What resources do you use? What challenge do you face processing all that information?
Yeah, so you know, I think that that's a great question. When it comes to data and even just our group, so our group is made up of economists and data scientists. And so even the economists look at as much data as they possibly can. We were reviewing with a vendor, you know, how many different series or how many different things we look at over a given year, and it's a lot. So I think the more that you can be curious about what's available or how do we find ways to really leverage that or view it, visualize it, model it, the better off you'll be. But there's certainly, you know, plenty of challenges along the way to actually getting data, then going through a process of modeling or coming up with summary statistics, and then really what's the end output? How do we visualize that? How do we communicate it to others? And so I think the more that you constantly stay curious, the better off you are. But there's certainly plenty of challenges that come up along the way. So
maybe a bit related to this, there was an anonymous question that asked, have you had any issues with using large data sets in R? And do you have any favorite packages to deal with that?
yeah, so you know, I think when it comes to that, R works for just about anything, at least from what I've found. There's certainly times where you're trying to do too much with it and it might be slow, but generally speaking, you could load in massive files and manipulate all of it and then output it to some small table. I think that SQL is kind of the natural progression to larger and larger data. That could be, you know, a million different things, or you could view that in a million different ways, but finding some way to store the data and then to pull some level of calculation without pulling the full thing, that's kind of the best solution. So dbplyr is kind of the go-to, at least for me. I like writing, you know, in R more than I like writing SQL, even though I do totally value SQL, and I think it's a valuable skill. You know, I just love tidyverse and R packages. So.
Thank you. So, Saul, I see you just asked a question around metrics for success. Do you want to add a little bit of context there? Or I can just ask. The question is, what are metrics that Mastercard uses to measure success or impact?
I think that's a great question. It's something that I think about often. I don't know that we have a perfect solution for that. You know, I think if you are generating revenue, that's a super simple way to, you know, kind of measure success. Our group currently, you know, we are pursuing that, but when we got started, you know, that wasn't part of what we were doing. And so I think that that's really when it starts to get down to, you know, how much are we communicating with clients? How much are we communicating with stakeholders? Are we helping them to do their jobs better, or to have a better understanding of, you know, data or the macro view? And, you know, are we really enabling them to do better? And so I think there's plenty of opportunities to kind of measure or to try and figure out, you know, how do we view this as valuable? But I think those are kind of the two avenues that I would kind of identify.
I know one of the examples you had shared with me was on like travel and sharing some of those insights. I guess taking that like success question a bit further, like how would you measure success for that project?
Yeah, so I think very early on, we kind of identified core themes. And so we started with this idea of, you know, how do we come up with, you know, 6 or 7 themes that broadly we want to cover or that we want to have a view on? And then how do we constantly kind of enhance it? So if you were to look at our first project or our first, you know, dashboards or reports, we took a view or tried to come up with a view, and then we constantly just made it better. So I don't know that we had any measure of success other than, you know, people telling us that they liked it, they valued it, you know, they appreciated it. But in terms of kind of measuring how well we're doing, I think it's certainly an area that we could probably do some more exploring or thinking through. So.
Thank you. And I just shared that link in the chat if people want to check out some of that work too. Sup, I see you asked a question in the chat. Can I pass the mic over to you?
Yeah. Thanks, Zach, for sharing a lot of these insights. A lot of the discussion earlier was around like, you know, kind of coding and things of that nature. How do you, I guess, how do you ensure that like your team is all kind of is up to date, basically? Like, you know, a lot of people have different varying levels of skill with regard to coding or data science. How do you guys kind of make sure that people are kind of in sync?
Yeah, no, I think that that's a great question. And even for, you know, data scientists, so like for me, I'm very code first. But a lot of people that we work with or that are part of our group, they work within Tableau. And so even with Tableau, you know, the funny thing about it is there's, and I'm probably kind of getting sidetracked with a different, maybe I'll mention that after, but there's no easy way to make sure that everyone's on the same page or has the same code or has the same understanding of code. What's worked for us is trying to figure out, you know, how do we leverage each other's skills, regardless of technologies. And, you know, a great example is really Tableau. So the economists will come up with these great views or these great dashboards, and then I can take those and make them into code or find ways to visualize them differently, put them into a public report. And so I think it's really just gets down to communication, having an understanding of skills, and then trying, you know, along the way to teach each other and to learn. And so I guess the side portion that I was going to go off into was under the hood, Tableau is XML. And so for a coder, like I love trying to parse all of it and trying to understand like what can I pull out of this, or, you know, how do I pull this color palette, or things that are kind of more nerdy. But it's, you know, finding ways to do what you love, even though it might not be with the tool you love or the technology, you know, it's always kind of the path that I've taken.
Thanks.
Expanding on that a bit further, I see there was an anonymous question that says, what are your thoughts on the no code movement and auto ML?
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, there is value in no code and people that don't code. I guess from my perspective, the reason why I love coding is it offers unlimited possibilities. So I think the main difference for me has always been, if this solution doesn't do what I want it to do, is there any way that I can fix that? Or am I kind of set with what is available? And so for me, I love developing new things or trying to generate, you know, different ways that we could do something. And so that flexibility for me has always been super important. But that being said, you know, there's a lot of value. Like I always go to Tableau as a great example, because dragging and dropping and creating beautiful visualizations or decks, dashboards is super, super valuable. And yeah, I think both are super valuable. I've just always been very code first because I like developing, and yeah.
Thanks, Zach. One other anonymous question that came in was, how do you balance your passion and personal interests and business requirements when it comes to adopting tools and projects?
Yeah, I think that's another great question. It's not always easy. And you always have to find ways to have some level of balance between both. And a good example is, so when I first started, we had to really come up with a business plan and a way to communicate that. and we wanted to do something kind of crazy or off the wall. And so we used Prezi, and it was a great, it was a great presentation. It was very fun. It was very interactive. And then eventually I coded, an HTML presentation, but I think there's always a balance of, figuring out like, what do we really need? And is this the right solution? And then at some point, the hope is always that you can really, really leverage your skills because you're starting to produce, things that always can answer questions or can always satisfy some need. But that certainly takes time, and it certainly doesn't happen, overnight. But the more that you have kind of your passion in your work, the better. And so I think the more that you kind of push that agenda or trying to find ways to do what you love, the better off you are. So.
Your answer and just mentioning like presenting the business case was making me think of something I had meant to ask earlier as well, but around the Economics Institute in general. Could you explain a bit more about what that is and how it serves as an innovation lab?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're really a group of, economists and data scientists, and our job is to really come up with great stories and great insights. And, I think that we've always taken the view of trying to view things differently, trying to find the hidden story or the thing that no one's else, is looking at. And I think that when we look at the group as a whole, what we're really talented at is constantly being in communication with, clients, stakeholders, really understanding what challenges or things that they're going through, and then finding ways to really explain what's going on. How do they think about that? How do they view it or come up with new ways to approach it? And so I think, the group as a whole is made up of a lot of very curious and hardworking individuals. And I think that's really created kind of an environment where, we're constantly just trying to find cool things to show or communicate. And then, how do we help people to do what they do better? And so.
Cool. I see Zorlu, apologies if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, that you asked a question that follows this as well. But when you say like do really cool things or show cool things with data, what are some of the most interesting insights that you've gotten so far from projects you've worked on at Mastercard?
Yeah. I would say it for the most part is all pretty interesting. Sometimes, as a data scientist, it's hard to keep up with what all of the different views are or all of the interesting insights that the group generates as a whole. I would say for me, I've always enjoyed, really finding ways to visualize things. So right now I'm trying to learn D3 because I just find it so cool. And it's super difficult. And it's not, it's not coming easy, but I think even within Tableau, we have an economist. I always look at her dashboards and I'm like, wow, this is so cool. And, I think it's really just trying to find things that are interesting and that you would enjoy or that you find cool, and then, communicating it. But I guess like, I don't know if there's a specific example. Like I would say the small business report, there's things I find super cool in that. There within the travel report, there are things that I found super cool in that. But yeah, I don't know. It's probably an answer of there's so many things that are fun or cool to look at. It's probably hard to kind of pick one.
In terms of the small business report, what does that show, or what is that? Is that a visualization that you put? Or?
Yeah, so I think when when you look at our public reports, and even just, I can openly talk about kind of what's under the hood. So our public reports, for the most part, have always been built with R Markdown. And I think that we try to push it to the limits of what that can do. But generally, it's a very easy framework to use. You can constantly improve it. And so I think there's always this element of what it started with was really, analytics stuff, right? Where it's very analytics heavy. There's a very, kind of standard view of color, where we started to transition to more elegance and design. How do we create something that people are going to find visually appealing? And so I think that's probably like my side gig is design. I enjoy it, and I think that we bring in a lot of visualizations that weren't built with R. So things like video or pictures or graphics that are animated. And so I think it's just finding cool ways to show what you're trying to think through or trying to communicate. But I certainly kind of love when my graphics make the end cut as well. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Just scrolling through to make sure I didn't miss questions from earlier. I see Saul maybe had dropped off, but asked a question earlier on how would you advise people to learn topics like econometrics, having a limited statistics background?
That's a very good question. So what the one thing I've realized about economics is I thought I had some level of background in it. And then you meet a bunch of smart economists and you realize you really don't know much. And so I think at the end of the day, there's so much that you can always learn. Econometrics is not super straightforward is probably the blunt answer. It's complex. There's lots of things that need to be considered or treated for. And I think that I'm constantly learning about it, or trying to understand it. But I don't know that I have any tips for here's great references or, a lot of this stuff I've kind of learned on the job, and over time. And so, yeah.
Thank you. Going back to that last question a little bit, I know you said you like design, and it's great when sometimes your visualizations are the ones put out there. How do you kind of test design and think about like what appeals to people and what's going to maybe catch people's attention the most?
Yeah. I think just trying new things is kind of the fun part about design is there's always some way that you could show it differently. And there's always a different color palette or a different font or a different size of your header. And, I think all of those things kind of come together to create an output. And so the easiest way to play around with design is just kind of, I guess like design is mostly, at least for, web frameworks, it's just having fun with, CSS and JavaScript and kind of just diving in, changing around, backgrounds, or like we started with very, very bold and fluorescent colors. And then we realized, well, maybe not everyone likes looking at something so, intense. And, how do we make that maybe a bit more easy on the eyes, I guess? And, how do we change a color palette to really show what we're trying to visualize? And so I think all of those things are super fun to play around with. And yeah, just kind of getting in there and changing everything.
I know you said, well, you've said already too, but that Bricklin said you want this to be a place of innovation, and that there's been reports that were more of static text and PDFs, which you're trying to make cooler. I was just wondering, like, is there an example of a report that you've done that for internally, or what kinds of reports were those?
Yeah, so, I think that one of the big things that Griffin and I are always on the same page about was interactivity. So how do we increase someone's ability to really play around with it, or to really understand by kind of seeing the numbers along the way. And so I think most of our reports have really been designed around that. We try to stay away from PowerPoint unless we're presenting something kind of to the business side. We try to stay away from, kind of static outputs. But that being said, with our public reports, we still come out with PDFs that are gorgeous as well. So I think there's always that level of, you're never probably going to get rid of it all. And not everything can be interactive, but for the most part, we've made most of our outputs interactive, which is fun, for me and I think for just the team as a whole. So.
Cool, thank you. I'm scrolling through to make sure I haven't missed any questions right now, but just want to open up the floor to anybody if you want to jump in and ask anything live too.
So in Rachel's blurb about you before the meeting, said you're going to talk a little bit about writing a job description for tidy model engineers. I'd love to hear about that because I hate writing job descriptions, and I'm writing some right now. So.
Yeah, no, so I think even with, the way that we approach titles or what we're trying to look for, it's very much an experiment. I think the main driving factor of that was we wanted something different that really relate to the R community. I think a lot of our code is in R currently, and we're constantly trying to find ways to kind of increase, I guess, that portion of the business. And so I think the main driving factor of that role was just that we wanted someone that felt that they were, really talented with a specific skill to apply and to be found. And I think that that's always something that you find with data science, right? You post a data science role, and that could mean a billion things. And that's what's always difficult about data science is it covers so much that if you don't be, or if you can't find a way, that was bad English, but if you can't find a way to be really specific about what you're looking for, you're probably just going to attract a lot of people, but not as many people that are focused on what you're focused on or trying to accomplish. So. Yeah.
Thanks, Zac. Is there a question that you would like to ask to the audience? I didn't prepare you for that, but throwing it on you.
I think that's, I mean, I'd just be interested, like what everyone does, like what they enjoy, do you like coding? Do you not like coding? Anyone that wants to kind of introduce themselves just on a personal level, that would be really cool. Thank you for everyone that has asked questions. Yeah.
I do have perhaps a related question, but I'm happy to introduce myself as well. My name is Sep. I enjoy long walks on the beach since I live in Southern California. But I work for Concert AI, which is a real world data company. We work in basically cancer analytics, to kind of sum it up. I'm curious because I've been a part of this wonderful little meetup for some time now. And we talk a lot about like Python and R, and those are generally our data science tools. But I'm curious, and this also could be for you, Zac, but for anybody else, is what are people's thoughts on limiting or minimizing use of both languages? So let's say you minimize Python or you minimize R and just try to consolidate the team on one. My personal opinion is that there's technical debt that accrues as more languages you apply, because people obviously are comfortable in one or the other. But I'd love to hear what other people's thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I would be curious to hear everyone's thoughts as well. And maybe I'll just kind of quickly, um, I think it's a great question. And I'd agree that there's some level of the more technologies that you use or the more factors that you have in what makes up, a data science team, sometimes it could be hard. But I also, have the sense that there's a lot of value in both, or multiple. And the more that you can find ways to leverage it, the better. But I think it's just a great question. So I'd be curious if anyone wants to weigh in as well.
I see Brian's
I'll jump
unmuted.
in. Hi, I'm Brian Butler. I manage a small data science team at banking. I am a fan of both. In fact, my junior data scientist, before he was started with me, he was mostly R, and then he converted all to Python, and now he's doing all Python. But I'm like, these are tools. I think about a carpenter. How many nail guns do they have? How many different saws do they have? It's the same thing. Like if I want to bang out a quick analysis, I'm going to do it in R. I can load the data in, I can write 2 lines of code, and I've got a ggplot that's interactive and everything else, and boom, I can solve that question pretty easily. Now, at the same time, as if I'm going to do some serious natural language processing or some deep learning, I'm going to switch gears. But the best part of it is what I like doing is wrapping Python into R Markdown and doing presenting through these interactive apps that you can use with, Plotly and R and everything else, and then you wrap the base model of Python around it. And so, I mean, I just think you're not going to be skilled at every tool you use, but I think the more tools you have, you'll be more effective because you'll find the right one for the right job.
I think that's a great answer. Yeah.
I see Flores and Rick are both unmuted, so I take that as raising hands.
Maybe if I can
Oh,
jump
you
in
can.
there real quick.
Sure,
So,
go
um,
ahead, Rick.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Flores.
You go ahead, Flores.
Oh, okay. Hello. My name is Floris Pat. I'm from the Netherlands. Actually, first time I joined this group. But I think it's a great question. And actually, the same applies for packages within R, because you have so many packages. You could restrict yourself to all kinds of packages. Actually, I just heard dplyr. I'm very much in front of data table, to be honest, but I use them both. And I see that both deliver a lot of value. For us, how we use it is we just have good documentation, how to use the packages, how to do your coding, so we can always take over work from each other. I think the same applies for using Python, R, but even Julia or Go, if you add it to your Markdown, can be used as long as you just document it well.
I actually love that. Yeah, I think that documentation and having an understanding of how to use something is always something that's worth solving for. And yeah, I really like that answer, because like I would love to go into an R Markdown and see like 20 different languages and find ways to get value out of all of them. That'd just be kind of fun. And so I really like that answer.
Yeah, just and one addition for the whole documentation, we use actually the book down. I think it's also from. I never can pronounce his name, to be honest, but it's amazing. So we have many of those book downs where you just like Hadley created this the R for data science. It's really great to do your documentation for your whole team, and we publish it on a web server. Easy to search for all your style guides for everything you have. And yeah, that's amazing.
I like it.
I would also echo the sentiment of using lots of different tools. And I'm just teaching a data science full 3-month bootcamp kind of course at the moment, and we just wrapped up. A lot of what's going to be R, and we're going to move on to Python next week. And I told the students right from the outset that we're going to be using both R and Python. And I try to always highlight why we're doing this in R. Like we just all the statistics was in R, database was all in R, data munging was all in R, reporting was all in R. And when we want to Python, we'll be doing the deep learning and machine learning and things like that inside of Python. But I'm not going to make them do statistics in Python. I don't think it's worthwhile, and I don't think it's nice to do data munging in Python either. So if they have nice tools to do that also in R, so I'll show them some of it, but I'm not going to. They're not going to be at the same level and all skills in both of them. So I like the idea of use the tools that you got and use the diversity that you got instead of trying to do an us versus them. No, you got to do everything in this package or everything in this language, and everybody on that side is wrong. Kind of sentiment I think is something that I don't try and reflect in my work and give to my students either. So I like that idea of kind of using all the resources you have available to you. But when I talk to people on the ground who are not just training, but actually working in companies and consulting, they say, well, actually what really happens is that you can use R, but the IT department is not going to support you in anything. If you use Python, at least they'll take a look at your scripts and they may give you some critique and try and help you understand what's went wrong. So the support that they get from other departments of the company also determines what they're actually going to use in the end. So there's that practical component that is not as idealistic, I think.
No, I think that's accurate. I think at the end of the day, that kind of gets back to sometimes you have systems and that's what you got to use, even if there's a better solution. And so I think that's always, on the table or part of it. And I think the only way that you can get kind of people to convert or to see your side of it is just to create something cool. I think at least that's worked for me is if you can show someone something cool, then it's kind of easier to say, yeah, this is why I use this, or yeah. And so I guess like that's it's always part of the game. And I find that the more you can make it fun or interesting is always the easiest way to kind of.
Thanks for all of that. And for everybody, can I add context to this question?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
I was gonna say thank you for asking that question and seemed to fire everyone up.
Yeah, no, I should have asked it way sooner. I apologize. So this is great. So I don't disagree with everybody. I think that obviously all of these tools have a place in everything. So well, sometimes Python, especially from a data engineering perspective, that's what people are using for ingestion, for ETL. And so it's really helpful to have that tool set. And generally, you'll always have that tool set. And for R, for its variety of purposes. What's interesting is what I see from like an industry perspective is that there's also a component, that technical debt that you accrue when people are using multiple languages, is that there are systems that need to support those languages, right? So as Rick pointed, sometimes it's Python and that's what they're supporting, right? Sometimes it's R, sometimes it's both. But when you have more systems or languages you need to support, there's more libraries, there's more whatever, all of that plays a technical debt on whatever the IT system, whatever the platform system. So generally you don't want to have 20 languages, you want to limit it. And so Python and R is fine, but there's also a technical debt towards expertise, towards like if I only know how to do it in SQL and I only do it in SQL, but another team is doing it in Python and another team is doing it in R, right? You now have 3 different ways that you're approaching perhaps the same problem, and people only want to then deal with it in the language that they're most familiar with. And so from a broader perspective, when you're trying to scale, like it might be helpful to say, look, I know you know how to do it in SQL, but learning it in R or doing it in Python or whatever the choice would be may have value for the company as it scales, because once that person leaves or if they go on vacation or something, someone else can then pick it up. And then I think Flora said documenting it appropriately is great. And I 100% agree, but I guess that's just the context behind the question. I'm not trying to say that we should pick one language or another, but I guess, yeah.
Maybe if I can jump in on one quick comment about that. One of the things that I noticed, we were writing the book this past year, the R and Python for modern data science. And we kind of almost had a hard time finding nice use cases. And I got some examples from colleagues on Twitter, but I realized that, we organized the book in terms of you choose R, Python, dependent on the type of data that you're working on. So if it's time series or unstructured or geospatial, there's different package ecosystems that are well suited in each of the languages. And some of them are better than others. Like Spacey is fantastic for NLP. I wouldn't necessarily recommend, although there's fantastic things for NLP in R, but Spatie is really kind of dominating that scene in Python. And so we kind of said, think about the data structure, the format of the data, and the kind of research problem that you're dealing with. And then in the case study, we were kind of struggling to find a really nice flow, like really nice example. And we got something really nice at the end, I think. But it also occurred to me that one of the reasons people end up using R and Python that I see actually in reality with my students that are working in research is that they come into a laboratory and they inherit a really terrible Python script that they cannot make heads or tails out of it, but the thing works. And there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, but they want to wrap it in R because they can modify and do things with it and expand on it in R. So instead of learning, and these are like crazy long and super complicated scripts that I guarantee are much, much easier in R, but they don't have the time to translate that all to R. So they stick with it, and then they just kind of have to deal with a Python script. So I think sometimes people use R and Python, not because idealistic reasons, not because they don't want to, but because they're stuck with it. Like they have to use this Python script or this R script because somebody wrote it and dumped it on their shoulders.
100%, that's accurate.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, I think it's a super interesting question because it's super applicable, and at every step of scale, that complexity or that ease has to be kind of addressed. And so it's almost like we know that that's a topic. We know that people are going to use both. How do we really prepare for that or address it? And I think like RStudio probably has the best, answer for it, but or they're working on it, one of the two. But I think that it's certainly possible that you're building without that full circle, view of it, right? Like I know that there's a lot of people developing Python that I don't know, and probably vice versa. And so, yeah, it's hard to have kind of a perfect solution for all of it, but I think it's an interesting question.
One thing that I found really useful was that I have not restricted languages on my teams, and I'd see certain people, because of their backgrounds, they were either more comfortable with one or the other, which was nice because it allowed for a lot of cross-training. But then if people were unsure about a problem, there were even more ways to try to come to an answer, and understanding from a different approach, whether it Python or R or different packages, was really good and thought-provoking, and found more errors and got better answers in the end. There is definitely stress from having more languages, but I think it's worth it.
I like that. Yeah. And I think like, the one thing that you just said was, there's almost some stress from that. And I think Sep asked an earlier question about, how do people stay up to date on languages? And so I think that's one of the hard things as well, is like, if you're constantly doing something other than that, how do you stay up to date on what's going on or what's important? But I love that there's multiple ways to answer that, and like it offers more capabilities to do that, because that's really, really valuable. And so I think that's awesome.
Yeah, all good conversation. Hi, this is Bala. I just want to add one thing, Seb. So right now, if you restrict, so both Python and R right now has so much maturity, and it's open source, right? A lot of packages are being contributed. For most of the standard use cases, you get packages which are wrapped around the package which is run in Python. So if there is a Spatie package for NLP in Python, there is a Spatie R, which is a wrapper which basically runs the same package in the R environment. So if it is a generic use case which is being used across multiple industries, then you really don't have that problem. Like, oh, my developer it's much easier to migrate because the speed to market is what you, as a data scientist, you would like, as a data team, you would like to do. So a problem is given, you want to solve it as quicker as possible. And if you're taking, or if you're adding red tape saying like, oh, you can't use Python or you can't use R, you're naturally creating blockheads. So I would say you should allow your team to explore in whichever language which is comfortable for them. But again, when they design, just think about like, are there wrappers? Can I integrate, whatever I've done so that it is future proofed, just in case.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't have any restrictions. I just thought it was an interesting thought experiment. So before everyone spears me and cancels me or whatever. But yes.
Thank you, Sep. I would love for you to introduce your cat as well over there.
Can I add one thing? And I'm completely, I agree with you, Sep. So, and you need to restrict on your technical debt. It's difficult to keep everything up and running. Just also for Rick, we had a very specific use case where we actually needed to use Python. There was a package in R in 3.6 to connect to the SAP systems and to extract data. That one was not maintained anymore by the maintainer from Australia. SAP is maintaining a Python package. So now we are using a Python package to get the stuff in R, use reticulate to get it in R and manipulate it in R again. So now we have to have them both, but we have a very strict distinction between the functionality. One is importing the data, the other one is building your model and creating your visualizations.
I like that. It's a really nice example. You kind of got stuck with it.
And her name is Excel, actually. I'm kidding. No, her name is Zoe. Her name is Zoe.
Bruno said, bring all the cats next week. Well, thank you all so much for a lively discussion. I just want to make sure I didn't cut off any final questions there. We're a little bit over, but thank you so much for joining today. And Zach, thanks so much for sharing your insights with the group. Just a quick question for you, Zach. If people have follow-up questions, or is the best way to get in touch with you LinkedIn or Twitter, or what do you prefer?
Yeah, no, LinkedIn works great. And thanks so much for all the fun. I had a lot of fun. So thanks for spending some time with me, and thank you so much for organizing. Thank you.
Appreciate it. And I know I haven't been saying this lately, like who are the next speakers, and I don't mean to be keeping it a secret. So same time, same place next week. We'll be joined by Kobe Abayomi, who's a vice president of data science at Warner Music Group as well. So thank you all for joining, and hope to see you next week too.